Yeah, welcome to a new data science seminar. It's my great pleasure to welcome Chen from Imperial College London and the University of Oxford. And also welcome to Lena Meyer-Hein, who will take over the introduction. The stage is yours, Lena.
Yeah, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Chen today. She is a postdoc at the University of Oxford and also an honorary research fellow at Imperial College London. She received her Ph.D. from the Department of Computing at Imperial College London in January last year, actually, and also worked as a part-time research scientist at HeartFlow. Her doctoral thesis was entitled Improving the Domain Generalization and Robustness of Neural Networks for Medical Imaging, very timely topic, and was featured in Computer Vision News magazine. Very impressively, she also won several challenges, including the multi-sequence cardiac MR segmentation challenge in 2019, and very recently the fetal brain tissue annotation and segmentation challenge, FETA, last year. I invited her when I saw her last year, actually, as an invited speaker at a MICA workshop dedicated to the topic of augmentation. So Chen, looking forward to your talk. The stage is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lena, for the great introduction about myself. So today I will be giving a talk on the topic of advancing deep medical image segmentation with adversarial data augmentation, which basically summarizes what I have been done in my past PhD study. And so without further ado, let's get started. Okay. So the talk today will be divided into 5 parts. I will first give a brief introduction and directly dive into the problem behind the AI for medical imaging, the domain shift problem. And we will discuss our solutions on 2 aspects. One is focusing on the input space adversarial data augmentation, and the other one is focusing on the feature space adversarial data augmentation. And hopefully we will end up with some thoughtful discussions and some takeaway messages. Okay, so before I go into talk about my research, let me first talk about give you a picture about how AI can actually improve healthcare, particularly how it can improve the entire workflow of medical imaging. So here is a typical workflow shown here, where actually AI can help to speed up image acquisition, reconstruction, and image analysis, as well as some follow-up studies such as diagnosis and treatment planning, which are of greater clinical value. So it is expected that actually AI can remove or minimize the time spent on routine, for example, some administrative tasks, some tedious works, which can take up to 70% of a healthcare practitioner time. So with that, clinicians can actually have more time to care and interact with patients, which is the ultimate goal of our AI for healthcare, which we're trying to improve the quality of healthcare. And my research is mainly focusing on the AI for medical image analysis, which takes lots of time if you do it manually. So here, give a cardiac image segmentation as an example. We can actually quickly perform medical image segmentation from different imaging modalities. And for radiologists, it usually can take roughly, for example, 10 minutes or even half an hour to annotate the contour of the anatomical structures for measurement and to spot any abnormal tissues. But with AI, which it can just take a few seconds to get a full picture of clinical useful information, such as the shapes, volumes, etc. So because of its great efficiency, now we can use it actually to analyze large population data for clinical study, as well as some phenotype discovery. So AI has great potential to speed up and transform healthcare services. Okay. But however, we found that so there is a news published in MIT Technology Review saying that for the hundreds of AI tools which have been built during the COVID time, actually none of them are really help. And the problem behind it is so-called the domain shift problem. So here I just using a sausage examples. So imagine you have an AI system trained using Chinese sausages, okay, which looks like this. And then if you want to deploy it to German market, which they have really large varieties of sausages, white sausages, the colors, the shapes can have great variability. So you know that actually we need to mind the gap between the training images and test images, okay? So in medical domain, the domain shift problem is actually very common. So normally what we are facing is that we have a very limited training data set collected from a very limited population, and the models can actually perform pretty good on this type of images. However, if we directly test it on the test domain, which basically has a larger variability, comes from like different scanners, different medical image acquisition protocols, or different populations, such kind of the variations may not be handled well in the current AI models. And another challenge behind it is so-called the different image quality due to different image, the scanner configurations are like some patients, they may have some disease, they cannot hold their breath properly, so that the image quality can also be affected. And that will introduce some artifacts into these images, which will also pose for the AI model to predict nicely on that kind of images, okay? So here is a real examples where we're trying to train our AI models to predict the cardiac shapes from the MR images. And we trained using, which might be the largest data set in the world from the UK Biobank data. So basically it consists of 5,000 subjects from single scanner. So we found that it can actually perform pretty well in the intradomain UK Biobank data set. However, if we directly deployed to France, to ACDC, which is a public data set collected from a French hospital, we found it can still fail, even the model has been trained on a very large scale population. So this highlights the issues behind the AI models. Another example is from the recent SAM models you may heard from that is developed by Facebook, trying to develop universal segmentation models. So we tested it on these SAM models using our very simple original image. So it can perform pretty well on these original images, where basically the left ventricle blood pool has been notated. And if we're using our developed some augmentation tools to introduce some domain shifts into this image, so basically it basically introduced some morphological transformation and some intensity transformations. We found that some can actually produce not stable results. So basically trying to segment some non-useful information, such as the background and the contour of this subject. Okay, so how could we develop a robust models using limited data? One of the solution is maybe we could just collect lots of data from multiple different training sets from different hospital and cover lots of different populations, right? But this is not that easy to do. Why? So there are several reasons behind it. So firstly, it has a very high labeling cost because unlike natural images, medical images typically require people to have such kind of medical expertise or some medical knowledge to identify the region and then perform the segmentation. It usually requires more money or pays more money to do it. And the second problem is about the label inconsistent issues. So normally, because we have large multiple data sets from different hospitals, they might be labeled by different labelers or different group of experts, and they may have some kind of inconsistent labeling protocols, which can hidden the model to generalize well from such of chaotic data sets. And the last issue is the most important one, that is the data sharing and the data privacy issues as posed by the recent, for example, GDPR, and I think different countries, they have different privacy policies that basically prevent people to directly sharing data across different countries. And even for like different institutions in the same country, sharing data can be also very not easy job because it might involve lots of some legislation routines or works to do. So a more practical thing is that we wonder if we could directly learn a robust domain generalized segmentation model using a single domain data. That is how we face this scenario every day, right? So normally we have collaborators from one hospital and they provide us a clinical data set, and we're trying to learn some AI models to help them. And we're trying to maximize the value if it can be directly developed or deployed into different unseen test data sets. So how could we do that if we only have access to a single domain data? So our approach is so-called adversarial data augmentation. And the idea behind it is that we're trying to synthesize a virtual domain, which contains some realistic and diverse and challenging image variations to enhance the training data set. We added into the original training data set and then use it as a data augmentation to improve the model training. And with the hope that finally the performance on those unseen data sets can be improved. So how could we do that? So in this talk, I will try to investigate the two roads to do the adversarial data augmentation. And the first one is trying to do it directly from the image space, where we're trying to simulate some challenging transformations in order to augment data. And the second part will be about the visual space. We're trying to learn some unknown variations in the image itself. Okay, so let's first talk about the first approach, the image space adversarial data augmentation. So for the input image space data augmentation, I guess the most popular examples are everyone might already know well is about this adversarial noises, which is initially developed by Ian Goodfellow in 2015, where you're trying to generate some noises that can be, when we add these noises into these original panda images, the AI models can actually classify it from panda to gibbon, which is totally a different species. And people found that we can actually add in this type of images into the training and can improve the robustness against such a type of noises. So in medical domain, there are also some very similar phenomena has been found in some publications. For example, they're trying to add in some adversarial noises into these skin lesion images. And as you see, the AI systems can actually misclassify it as a malignant rather than benign. And this also poses the issues or concerns about the AI safety. And also people may use it to get some money from the insurance company. So it's very important for us to incorporate such kind of data into the training in order to improve the model safety. However, while this can be very useful, there are also some limitations behind these approaches. So first of all is that it can be very limited in terms of the effectiveness, because the adversarial noises may not necessarily exist in medical world, right? The second one is about its limited diversity. As you see from these two images, the appearances differences is very minimum. So basically, we didn't really consider about some real image variations that may consider in the medical world. So one of the work we developed is trying to, instead of simulating some adversarial noises to attack the model, we tend to model some realistic physical world attack that really exists in the medical world to improve the model robustness and generalization. And one type of perturbation comes to our mind is so-called the bias field, which basically introduces some realistic intensity inhomogeneities in the MR images. So in real world, actually, MR images are often corrupted with this kind of bias field, so which is basically caused by the non-uniformity of the coils. And so such kind of low frequency signal, which smoothly varies across the images, can actually produce some challenges for the model to generalize well. And as you see that here, if we're trying to perturb the image with some bias field, it can affect its grayscale, and it can affect the intensity distributions even within the same tissue. As a result, the AI models can fail to recognize the shape of this myocardium. So we would like to model such kind of challenging bias field with the hope that the network can learn some more robust features against potential signal perturbations. So in order to model this type of bias field, we introduce a very simple bias field generator, which is a physics-based transformation model parameterized by a set of uniformly distributed control points. So specifically, given a set of control points, we basically randomly sample these values over these control points, and then we apply some B-spline interpolation kernel to generate some positive bias field at the full resolution. And then we multiply it with the image to get augmented images. So normally we can do it, just treat it as a random augmentation each time, but we are not limited to do that. We're trying to learn are trying to identify the model weakness by generating some adversarial bias field. How could we do that? So in order to learn some adversarial bias field, we developed a framework called ADV bias, adversarial bias, which is based on some consistent regularization framework. So the idea here is pretty simple. So here, give an input image X. We first randomly sample control points to generate some random bias field, and then we get our augmented images. We send these two images into the network to get the original prediction and the perturbed prediction. And we then calculate the consistency regularization loss term. So essentially, it can be just a mean squared error loss. And then we're trying to optimizing the underlying values of these control points with the hope that it can fool the network to basically mispredict the myocardium region, okay? So this is the first step. With that, once we found such kind of adversarial bias field, we can then add it into the training of this network. Well, here, because we did not use any ground truth to calculate the consistent regularization term, it can be fit well into the current existing semi-supervised learning framework using consistent regularization. So the final training loss for the network consists of supervised loss and unsupervised consistency regularization loss computed on the labeled data points and the unlabeled data points. So in that, we can actually not only utilize existing labeled points, but also a large number of unlabeled data points in the data set. Okay. So now let's look at some examples about the adversarial bias field generation. Okay. So here is the input images and the ground truth. We can basically first randomly sample some bias field, as I previously mentioned, to get some bias field look like this, which basically you can see some regions are highlighted, which means that the value is more than 1. So part of the region will be brighter than before. And we found that actually the AI models, if you look at the predictions, show us these right contours, the network can actually perform pretty well, although it introduced some errors in the middle region of this blood pool. If we do one-step optimization to the underlying bias field, we can actually find that the network can be very sensitive to such a kind of adversarial bias field. So if you compare these two bias fields, you can see that it basically remain the two are actually very similar, and they just shift a little bit to the other regions, but the network can be very sensitive to such a kind of modification. So we already show you how we could generate some bias field. Now we wonder if we could apply it to simulate some realistic anatomical variations that is also very common in medical world. So for example, different individuals, they may have different anatomical variations. Even for the same patient, for the cardiac region, it can have different morphology due to the cardiac motion, okay? So in this work, we're trying to replace the previous bias field generator with this adversarial deformation generator model, where we're trying to simulate, which is based on the static velocity field based deformation model. I will give you more details about this region, okay? But the idea is basically the same, very similar to previous one. We get the input images and augmented images, and we're trying to optimize the underlying velocity field so that the network can perform very inconsistent predictions compared to the original one by optimizing the underlying velocity field, okay? And one thing we needed to take care of is about the consistent regularization, because now when we do some geometric transformation to the input images, the prediction geometric space has also been changed. So in order to measure the difference between the perturbed one and the original, we have to actually warp this prediction back to the image space, original image space, or so that they are in the same coordinates. So how could we do that? So here we highly rely on a specific type of deformation, which is so-called diffeomorphic deformation, which allows us to generate some invertible deformation. Here is more details about such kind of diffeomorphic transformation, where we assume that the deformation is controlled by a static velocity field. And we can basically, one of the nice property of such kind of diffeomorphic transformation is that it's invertible and it allows one-to-one mapping. So we can easily compute its forward and backward transformations that can easily transform the augmented images back to the original space, okay? So now let's look at some examples about the adversarial deformation generation. So the first step is still some random data augmentation, which basically can be viewed as some elastic velocity field deformation. And we found that if we directly add in some deformation, the net will actually perform well if we warp it back to the original space and then compare to the original prediction, okay? But if we do one-step optimization over the velocity field, we can see actually the network can be very sensitive, which produce some false positives near the cardiac region, which it looks like here, okay? And here, if we look at looking into the details of this deformation, we found that network will be more focusing on the adversarial morphological attack will be more focusing on attacking the local regions of this cardiac region, right? Rather than the overall this torso. Whereas if you look at this random deformation, you can see part of the deformation mainly happen on those task specific regions, for example, this torso here. But here, basically, it remains the same. The major deformation happens around this cardiac region, okay? So now I have introduce you about three types of adversarial attack: the noise bias field one and the velocity-based deformation one. And we further consider to add in like one more family, one more transformation into the family, which is affine transformation based. And this also corresponding to a very realistic variations caused by, for example, different patients. They might have different orientations or positions when they are being imaged. And also the scale of the cardiac can, the shape can be differ if you're using different field of view. So we're trying to incorporate this into this adversarial data augmentation framework. And in order to further enhance the diversity, we introduce an ADV train, which basically trying to, each time we just randomly sample a train of different compositions of transformation families. It can be adversarial bias field plus adversarial noise. It can be adversarial morphology plus adversarial affine transformation. So the underlying space of transformation has been largely improved using ADV train. And then the overall framework remain almost the same. The only difference is that every time we just randomly sample a train, which corresponding to some wide range of variations that exist in real world. So here is an example about the ADV train. We are given an input image at X. We're trying to first, for example, sample a train of transformation. So here we include adversarial noise, bias field, morphological transformation, and some affine transformation. As you see, if we plot the network predictions, basically the network can be very robust actually. This may be because we already include such kind of random data augmentation as the default pipeline when we train our models. However, if we apply one more step of optimization to optimize the underlying transformations or the data augmentation parameters, we see that the network can be very fragile to such kind of adversarial transformation, where it mispredicts the cardiac region, okay? And if we look at into the details about the adversarial noise and the morphological, as I previously mentioned, you will find that basically the adversarial data augmentation takes knowledge about the image and as well as the current state of the network, which is smartly trying to locate the region of the cardiac and trying to attack the local region. Okay, so here comes some results that we're trying to compare ADV Train, which is the adversarial data augmentation framework, to random augment, which is a very powerful data augmentation framework developed by Google. And we found that actually ADV Train can outperform the random augment, as show these blue boxes are the ADV Train results, whereas the red boxes are the results from the random augment. So normally our model, the ADV Train performs better than the random augment in this cardiac segmentation task. Interestingly, when we're trying to plot the generation or the generated images using random augment, we actually found a wider variability of this image intensity changes. Whereas for the ADV Train, we basically introducing some mild augmentations, but it consists of powerful morphological attacks, which is very common in medical world. And especially if you look at this image and this image, we found that actually it's very realistic simulations where the overall region or the overall structure of this patient remain almost the same. The major difference is the shape of the cardiac region. But by contrast, if you look at the random augment, so basically it's mainly focusing on generate some intensity attacks. Some can be very unrealistic. For example, where the intensity has been inverted in this type of change. Okay, so we further compare our method to a set of semi-supervised learning methods powered by different types of data augmentation. For example, the VAT is using some adversarial noise-based augmentation, and fixed apply some adversarial noises, whereas ours is powered by the ADV Train. And you see that out of all now this concludes the first part where we're trying to generate some adversarial data augmentation by taking consideration into a wide range of image space transformation functions into consideration. We're trying to first optimizing the underlying transformation parameters and then optimizing the segmentation network. So here is the QR code for the paper and the code. And we are very happy to see that actually ADV Train has been adopted in the winner algorithms by another research team in the CMR motion challenge. So this verifies the practical value of ADV Train for promoting or improving the model robustness. Okay. I will stop here to see if there is any questions for the first part. Any questions?
Any questions from the audience? You can post them in the chat or raise your hand. Actually, I have a question. So, I mean, I'm not familiar with the exact pipeline that you presented, but from let's say our work with the augmentations that we use, of course, you have a lot of hyperparameters in the pipeline. And to what extent do you think when you, let's say you have a running augmentation pipeline on one problem or on many problems, and then you have a new problem, to what extent do you think you can transfer those augmentation hyperparameters or starting points using the concept of meta-learning, for example?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. So the question is about because it involves so many transformations and also it breaks the optimization into two objectives. It can have lots of hyperparameters, and how could you how could I scale it to different approaches, right? Different applications. Did I understand correctly?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, how can you make sure you don't start from scratch, but you also have some knowledge on best type of parameters on a range of problems? So how can you leverage that knowledge for a new task, maybe?
Yeah, so I think ADV train is very kind of like easy to use. It's a plugin module. And actually, we found that we can, some hyperparameters, we did not require very exhaustive search procedure. Actually, we're directly taking the parameters from existing random data augmentation pipeline, which has been verified in lots of existing literature review. We're just taking that values. So this is focusing on the transformation parameters. Regarding for the optimization one, we're just using like one-step optimization and using some fixed length. And actually, we're using the same set of parameters for different tasks. For example, in our paper, we use the same parameters for the cardiac and prostate, and both works pretty well. And this basically verify how easily it can be used. And we in the GitHub, we also provide some Jupyter notebook. And our inspiration is that if you can generate, make sure that the variation is realistic, then it should be beneficial for the downstream task. So that's why we provide a Jupyter notebook for people to navigate the space of transformations, to set up the magnitude constraint, to make sure that the transformation is realistic. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Jan has a question as well.
Yeah, I find it super interesting. Thanks. And my question would be if you kind of try to look into which of these transformations is the most effective. If you try to take out, for example, some of the edge chain and see, which attacks the model the best.
So I think this is a good question. So the question is about do we investigate into effect of a particular image transformation function for the performance boost? And actually in our paper, we did investigate like by changing different compositions of the transformation. And we found that the result can be quite varied, it depends on specific task or the specific data set we used for training. So there is not a clear conclusion, say which one outperform the other three or which contributed the most. It really depends on the training data set composition as well as the test set.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Okay, any other questions? If not, I will go to maybe the second part. So the second part is about adversarial data computation via feature space perturbation. I think previously we have discussed a little bit about the limitation highlighted by Lena as well. Very thankful for the question. So basically, as previously we discussed, it requires you to specify a particular transformation function and some constraint, some hyperparameters to constrain the magnitude of this attack. So this all requires some expertise or for example, to first define a specific transformation function, for example, the bias field, and then you needed to set up the hyperparameters, for example, the bias field, the magnitude. So to generate more complex and some more unknown variations, we wonder if we could do it more smartly, because for the image space one, we can only generate or introduce some known variations. What about those unknowns? So our idea is pretty simple. So we're trying to let the model itself to figure out those variations. And in order to do this, we're trying to first project this image space into an image latent code via some projections. This can be done via encoder function. And then we can do some augmentation or perturbation directly in this latent code space, and then we can generate an augmented latent code, which can then be projected back into this image space. So you can this can be implemented using a decoder function. Okay, and one of the work we done for falling into this scheme is latent code masking based. I will first give you an overview about this framework. where we're trying to introducing auxiliary decoder branch here. Show are these gray blocks where we're trying to model the image generation process by first encode this image into the latent code and then use a decoder to map this latent code into the image space, okay? And then we extract some task-specific code from this content code into this shape code. And then there is a task-specific decoder or segmentation decoder that can interpret this back into the segmentation space, okay? So in order to simulate some corruptions or variations in real world, we're trying to looking at this content code and trying to perform some masking-based augmentation in the latent space so that we can simulate some corruptions into these images. And in particular, we're introducing 3 different types of perturbation, including the very famous or very popular random dropout one, which basically randomly drop out a particular channel, a particular channel at a probability of P. The other 2 are more aggressive, yet more challenging one, which basically is so-called the targeted channel-wise dropout or targeted spatial-wise dropout, where we're trying to utilize the gradient informations to identify those salient features to mask. And I will give you an example about how we do it in the next slide, okay? Overall, we generate these corrupt images by randomly choose one of the scheme each time, so that we can get a set of corrupted images into the training. And then we feed it back into the training of this this dual branch framework in order to enhance the training. Okay, so now let's look at one of these targeted masking scheme. So here is an example about how we generate some targeted masking by utilizing the gradient information, where we first calculate the gradient information of the loss function with respect to a particular latent code. And then we're trying to summarize the information in order to get a channel-wise map, where we select the top P% entries to mask. So here we consider to, instead of directly multiply it with all zeros, we're trying to multiply with a soft masking scheme using a random value sampled from 0 to 0.5. And this gives us much more diversity, but also help us to preserve some information in the images. I will give you an example later. So basically, with that, we can generate a masked latent code, and then we can project it back to the image space by sending it to a decoder function, okay? So here, this slide compares the generated images using different masking schemes. The first one is the random-based one. The second and the third row shows the results from the targeting-based one, which basically are more aggressive compared to the random-based one. So in practice, we're using the soft masking-based one, which can help us to simulate those strong image artifacts, but also it can preserve the larger structures well. One of the limitations of this masking-based method is that it cannot preserve local structures or minor structures. So in last year, Mikai, we proposed an enhanced version one based on the same network architecture. So the overall is still a very dual branch framework. The only difference is that this time we are not going to mask the latent code, but instead we introduce some insert some style augmentation layers, which is called max style. And with max style, we can actually generate our images with the same anatomical structure, but the image style has been changed. So as you see, with that, we can generate some augmented images back into the image space and use it as a synthesized domain. So the overall loss function remain the same. So we basically has a dual task losses. One is the segmentation loss, the other one is the reconstruction loss, and we compute the losses on the source domain and the synthesized domain. Okay. So here it gives you more details about how this style augmentation work. We are here given input images. We send this into the encoder and the decoder to get some feature code. We then augmented the style of these features in the latent space by performing some style mixing between different instances we further introduce more style noises into this latent style code in order to enhance the diversity of the features. And this will give us an image like this. So, but we are not limited to this like random scheme. So similarly, we also apply the adversarial training approach to enhance the effectiveness of generated samples for model robustness. And what we do is trying to finding optimum values of the style noises and the level of style mixings by searching in the direction of maximizing this segmentation loss, the task-specific loss, okay? So here is more details about this max style layer implementation. For the time constraint, I will skip this part, but we can go back to these slides if any people is more it has any interesting about to know this type of max style perturbation layer. So here is a result about this max style generated images. We are given input images and some ground truths. We can get some generated images using some random sampled style mixing parameters and style noise-based parameters. But we found that the network can still be very good at predicting such kind of style augmented images. With like 5-step optimization, we can find that the image style, for example, the brightness has been changed, and the network is very sensitive to such kind of type of change, which basically produce you poor segmentation results. So we found that max style can actually preserve well in terms of this structure similarity. If you compare the generated images and the original images structure similarity. So here is more results about how we evaluate our method on different test domains. So the first one is the easiest one. We're trying to directly test it on the intra-domain test dataset. This is the baseline method where we're just using some random data augmentation and with a unit segmentation model to get some results, a dual branch with a dual branch architecture. We also tested on 3 challenging out-of-domain test datasets, including the ACDC-C, which basically we're trying to augment the intra-domain test set with 4 existing 4 very challenging image artifacts, so that the signal has been corrupted in these images, okay? And the middle one is the core set, where we directly collect a large number of data sets from public challenge data sets from multiple different domains. And the last one is the most challenging one, because for the other 3, they are all using the same image protocol. They are all BSSFP image acquisition protocol acquired. Whereas the last one is a contrast enhanced one, so you can see that the appearance is very different from these other 3. If you look at the results of this baseline, you can see that while this baseline can perform pretty well on the intra-domain, it can totally fail on the other 3, especially the last one, okay? If you look at the max style results, we are very happy to see that actually it can produce results very close to the ground truth. So we further compare our method to a set of input space data augmentation and feature space data augmentation, including the previous mentioned adversarial noise, adversarial bias field, as well as some feature space data augmentation. So here we compared it to mixed style, which is a downgraded version of max style, using only style mixing rather than the style noise perturbation and adversarial training. LSM is the latent space masking based, which I introduced in as our earlier work, focusing on attacking the latent code by some random masking or target masking. So overall, the LSM is the most competitive one, but max style can actually outperform the LSM, which basically highlights the advantage of preserving the local structures while maximizing the style diversity. We further compare it here is a more like quantitative results, where we found that max style can gives you 20% more performance improvement in terms of out-of-domain generalization performance, while the intra-domain performance remains at the similar level as the baseline. You can find more results for different tasks. We also compare our method on the prostate segmentation task, and we found a similar performance boost is roughly also 20%. So here comes to the conclusion. So we talk about how important the data augmentation for model generalization and robustness, and how it can be very ineffective if we just randomly sample those values. In this talk, we show you how we could advance the data augmentation by thinking about the domain knowledge to simulate some image level variations, and how we could modeling the image generation from the latent feature space by using our dual branch framework. And lastly, for both roles, we can actually apply the adversarial training for improved data augmentation effectiveness. And one thing, one limitation about the adversarial data augmentation that I should mention here is that it actually requires additional training time and additional memory, because it requires at least one forward and one backward pass. So that's something that you need to keep it in mind. Here are some takeaway messages, which are taken from the London Underground, which you may hear every day. It's called say it, sort it. So basically, in order to improve, trying to relate it to model robustness, where in order to improve the model robustness, you need to first identify the model weakness, why it performs so bad on particular test set, and trying to simulate or replicate such kind of feelings by using some adversarial augmentation approach in order to search it in an efficient way. And then you can basically try to hopefully you can optimize the model for improve the model robustness. Okay. And here is I would like to take 1 minute to do some advertisement for the DALI workshop where I met Lena in this workshop. So we are going to organize hold this again in this year, Mikai. And the deadline for the submission is June 25. And we are very happy to get the some support from our industry collaborators, which will give us some award monies for the best paper. So I would encourage everyone who working on the data augmentation or some related domains to submit your papers to the DALI workshop. Okay. With that, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you for this great talk. Are there any questions? So as before, you can raise your hand or write them into the chat. Maybe Lena?
Yeah, I can start. So I have a question. It's more a strategic question. I think it's so difficult, right, to decide what to do when you have a new problem. So I'm back to that question.
Okay.
Because let's say you have a good budget, and then you have to decide basically how to organize your training data. So do you spend budget on more annotations, better data augmentations, or especially when it comes to style, do you instead try to basically organize your latent space such that the domain cannot be recovered anymore, and so on? So there's a lot of decisions to be made, right? So what if you let's say were hired by a company with an entirely new problem? How would you approach that problem of
I think
budget?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. So the question is about how could we start with a very new problem, so that the company might reach you with a set of data, but how could we start? I think this is nowadays people are thinking about AI from model-driven approach to data-driven approach, right? Because the AI models really requires massive data sets. And I guess one of the thing came to my mind to tackle this problem is build a cycle of the AI models. You can first train a model using maybe not that perfect data, right? And then you can use that model to identify those data points that have very poor performance. And then in that way, you can either identify whether this is the data problem or the model problem. And then you can basically recycle that model by enhancing it using some adversarial data augmentation or using some, for example, some knowledge distillation models to distill the previous knowledge into a large expanded model in order to incorporate such kind of challenging in the data. So I would say it's kind of like an iterative process, but it's important to first have a not so good model at your hand to start with to help you identify the models. Yeah, and also I'm very happy to say nowadays we have some universal models already, which help us maybe to bridge the gap for the preparation. Maybe you can directly take in some existing trained models to help us to identify the problem. And then using our domain knowledge, for example, we are all working on the medical domain, we know better than people working on general CV, right? So we can come up with better solutions to tackle a specific challenge behind the medical domain, and working close with clinician and specific domain experts to come up with the solution.
And do you think we should have something like data-centric challenges on topics where the model is fixed and maybe even the annotated input data is fixed, and you just have to come up with smart ways to handle your data, to do augmentations, etc., to move that field forward?
I guess this is a tricky question. So the question is whether we should fix the data and trying to optimizing the model itself.
No, the other way around, right? So normally you fix the data and everybody's working on the model architecture. I'm asking.
Okay, sorry.
So now we fix the model, let's say UNet and then UNet, whatever, and now we have to basically organize the pre-processing of the available data in a smart way.
Yeah, I guess I think there are already some areas have actually touched that aspect. Yeah. For example, active labeling. So the model, it may be fixed. I'm trying to select or like smart data selection, trying to identify those valuable data in order to train better our model. And alternatively, I think people can also think about some test time adaptation method, right? The model, actually, we're trying to optimizing the model to accommodate the particular variations from the test image itself. I think it's a very promising area, actually.
Yeah, agree. Further questions by the audience? Jan.
Yeah, hey, so my question would be, you showed us today a lot of heart MRI images. What about other images, and have you tried also on other kind of data types, your method?
Yeah.
Let's say microscopy would be my interest, for example.
Yeah. We didn't try on microscopy, but we did try on prostate MRI dataset, and we found it works pretty well. And we found that especially for the feature space data augmentation, it can actually working on even non-imaging data. For example, I have been saw people use by applying the mixed-style for the ECG data, which basically is a non-image data and perform pretty well. So I would say there is a huge opportunity, especially for the feature-based data augmentation, can be used to boost the general pipeline. And for maybe it's useful for your microscopy, as long as there is kind of like space for us to do, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And maybe very last question, because I'm always interested about problems. So is there something that you can point out that you struggled with in particular that was really challenging in your work that maybe you could share with the community?
Okay, yeah, this is a very good question. So one thing I would like to share is that so in my talk, I've been showing you two approaches, ADV training and the feature space. So I'm trying to combine them to see whether it can give you like a 1+1 larger than 2 effect. But however, I found that it's really difficult for me to replicate to maximizing the combination effect for the model robustness improvement. So I'm thinking about what's the problem behind it, and maybe this is because the model capacity is limited, and you have larger variations of this data augmentation that might not be useful anymore, or might be limited to improve the model performance. So that's one of the problem I'm struggling currently, trying to produce higher results if I can combine them two. because the ADV train is mainly focusing on not only image intensity level, but also geometric level, whereas the feature augmentation basically is more focusing on some intensity level variations that we are not so sure about. And it's really difficult to combine them two, and this is the problem, behind it. But I'm thinking it's a very promising approach. Yeah,
very interesting. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming as well. The talk, if you still agree, the talk will be online. I think that would be great. It was very, very nice talk, I think. And yeah, I hand over to Doreen for concluding words.
Yes. So yeah, thank you again for this great talk. Thank you to the audience, also to all the questions. And yeah, see you all in 2 weeks when we have Christoph Lippert. So you can see all the infos on upcoming seminars and also the recordings we have on YouTube. And yeah, feel free also to join our mailing list. See you all in 2 weeks. Goodbye.